Now watch this drive.
Going on, everybody? Welcome back to No Party Affiliation. It's just going to be Tom and I today. As you can see, Drew and Chris not here. Chris is some power outage stuff. Drew had something going on with the gay porn industry. I think you said something about that, right? Maybe.
I believe so.
Maybe it had nothing to do with that.
It's a gooning marathon.
A gooning marathon. That's it, yeah. Well, thank you guys for tuning in for just good old Tom and me. We're going to talk about, obviously, some things going on in the news. Maybe what's propaganda, maybe some things unanswered. These 11 scientists continue to sort of, I don't know, occupy the news space online, but not the actual news. Anything that I've seen that's official has been really minimal. I know that they announced recently that they were going to, like the Trump administration said it was going to investigate it. Like the Kash Patel was on the news saying they were going to look into it. I don't really see much coming out of that. What do you think?
I don't see much coming out of that either, because when McCaslin was taken, I was like, okay, this should be red flags. There should be a statement from the White House. This should be an all points bulletin to try and recover this guy. But as the days and the weeks went on and there was no coverage on it, and to me, this whole story has been driven by social media, because that's where I've been getting all the information that I've seen on the connections between the scientists and the military folks who've gone missing. And so now the mainstream media is hopping onto it, which, obliges the White House to start hopping onto it. So to me, it's just, there's a lot more going on than we're being led to believe that these are all random occurrences.
I agree. It almost seems like something that hits the social media sphere, hits a boiling point. It becomes the unavoidable thing for the official media or maybe an investigative arm like the FBI, and they have to say they'll do something. Otherwise, it becomes their lack of comment and their lack of action on it almost gets used as negative propaganda against them, even though agencies like the FBI should be so inundated with actual things going on around the United States. That maybe they're not looking into it because it seems so low priority. But one thing I've noticed too is that some of the state media from other countries now has picked up on how little this is being covered by the U.S. government and started to use it as propaganda against the Trump administration, against the United States in general. The stuff against the Trump administration is interesting because it's so irrational, I guess. It's somehow Trump had something to do with it, and they'll actually call these people scientists. It's very loose. That stuff is really easy to look through when you look at it from the lens of propaganda. Some of the other stuff I find to be really interesting is this is tied to the Iran thing, because McCaslin went missing hours before we attacked Iran. And then now there's Chinese state media saying that these people are missing because they discovered some sort of renewable energy source. And I've also seen it the other way, where it's Russian and Chinese operatives in the U.S. getting rid of American scientists because of the renewable energy thing. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I have seen a bit of that. And, with China's involvement, I kind of... That sparks my interest in going back to, what was it, MH60 that went missing, the Malaysian jet?
Oh, right. Yeah.
And the Chinese scientists that were on there, and the company that they had formed, and the technology that they were working on. So,
right.
is it related? I don't know. right off the bat, but it just kind of it puts that other dot in my head where, when we were talking earlier off camera about pattern recognition, is that part of the pattern, or is it part of the pattern that we're seeing with the missing scientists, and that is just one last step that or another step that needs to be connected. So it does come at a curious time. And also, with the folks that are missing and the folks who have gotten killed, is this a psyop that's being hoisted upon us to get people like us to start saying, oh, okay, well, here's the pattern that we're seeing, and it's sort of being, laid out in front of us. Is this a misdirect, I guess?
I could see it being used that way. It wouldn't be the first time our government has been involved in missing people or the death of people when it comes to cover-ups. We have talked about instances like that even on this show. I know that we've talked about it on our show too. Maybe you and Drew have talked about it in the past. One other thing I wanted to say about this, the foreign state media using this as well, really goes to show you how much the online American presence and like social media presence of the average person drives what sort of propaganda they make, because we put the things we're concerned about, the things we're angry about or sad about or whatever online every single day, and then the algorithm will pick it up obviously and show everybody what the majority of people are talking about. So then that generates whatever the state media from other countries is going to talk about. So now it seems interesting enough for them to use resources to try and insert that stuff in. But the thing about this, I've wondered two things, okay? Some of these scientists and or researchers, because they're not all scientists, we should say that up front, the things they work on are loosely related to one another. And by that I mean they're like energy related. And then some of it has to do with cancer research too. And so that's interesting. And it sort of ties into the next thing, that there are a very small number of people who work on these things. Very smart individuals, very credentialed people, very, cited and vetted people through peer review, all of these things. Like, it takes a lot of effort to get to the pinnacle of research like this at some of these places like MIT, right, which is where one of these guys was. And so is it the fact that there's such a small number of these people that it just seems connected by virtue of the fact that there's, maybe we're talking about, just to use a round number, 100 people. So anytime maybe you have 2 or 3 that just die randomly, let's just hypothetically, within a year, it's like, oh man, that's really weird because they're all tied into the same research. But it's like, well, there's only 100 of these guys, so it all seems strange. It could be something like that, but it also, because of it, it begs the question, is there some other connection? So I started looking into some of like who these people are, and there are some folks in this that I think that you could start to like line out when it comes to, well, their connection to this is probably just coincidental. And then there's some of this that's tied into places that have been traditionally linked to research, and then research that's been stifled, and then people who conduct that research being stifled, like Los Alamos, like Air Force, the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory, DARPA, some of these other places. They're traditionally wrapped up in cover-ups and government programs and black budget money, all of this stuff. So I think that it deserves its due diligence. Don't you agree?
I agree. And I also, in just kind of throwing this out there, as far as having these people who seem to be connected but sort of not connected, I start thinking back to the CIA, and I also start thinking about Bob Lazar talking about working at Area 51 and being very compartmentalized with what he was doing. So when I see something like this, I think to myself, okay, they could all be working on the same project, but not knowing it because they're compartmentalized. And so whatever their discipline is and what their research is adding to the bigger picture, which somebody else is overseeing the bigger picture of everything. So to me, that is a scenario that I keep going back to, and why these people are missing when it seems that they're coming from sort of the same sort of fields of study or research.
That's a good point, because listening to some of these interviews that Bob Lazar has done, he said that he was working within arm's reach of some of these people, and strictly told you're not allowed to talk to one another under pain of death, right?
Right.
So even though you're walking by these people, you know they're working on something, but you have no clue what you're working on in the proximity of one another. You still aren't allowed to talk to them, and just the military in general, which is my biggest experience with the government, is extremely compartmentalized. So what you're saying, I want to like add to the fact that yes, anecdotally that's true, factually that's true, completely and totally. And a lot of these really crazy projects are worked on and managed by people who are leading them remotely as well, I want to say. Because when I worked for Air Force Research Laboratory, whom General McCaslin was tied to, a lot of our project managers who were higher level officers like lieutenant colonels, maybe we did have a few generals that worked in and around sort of some of the things we were doing. None of them were where I was stationed at. A lot of them were back on the East Coast, and that makes sense, just by virtue of, again, the small number of people that hold these spots, or some of these folks who are actual scientists or engineers who are doing these things. So by virtue of it, the Los Alamos thing connection to me is the most interesting as far as when it comes to like a traditionally tied to black budget program. I had a female, well, she's female, but a relative who's a female now that I've said that out loud, who used to work at Los Alamos, and she did security there. I'll just put it that way. So she wasn't like tied into any sort of like black budget stuff, but she even at her level, just doing security, constantly being talked to and signing NDAs about times and places they need to be. And I've even been, and even my wife, when we've been stationed regularly conventionally in the Air Force, NDAs, or there were things going on where you weren't allowed to talk about certain times, the weather, places, what you're, what's going up, all that kind of stuff. And I think that lends credence to the fact that what is at the root of this is probably something that most people have no access to or don't know. So I'm like trying to, in my brain, distill the likelihood of this actually being connected to something that is classified or whatever. I feel like personally that it is. Is that sort of what you see as well?
I do, and if we get back to the compartmentalization of everything, if you've got like the researcher from California that got killed in the carjacking, he
Right.
may have just been a researcher, and the particular research that he was doing, he may had no idea that it was connected in any sort of way to a bigger project that was going on. All he knows is that he's getting funding money and he's continuing this research, and it's producing results that other people, are seeing, and more money is coming into him. And in that way, there is a separation between himself and if there is a larger entity that he probably has no clue even exists. And I would say that that his death, if you go down that road, would be totally random and something he would never expect in a million years, that somebody would be after him, because all I'm doing is research at this university. I have nothing to do with the government, even though it could be that he actually was and didn't know it. So to me, if you're going to cover your if you have such a clandestine project that you're working on, these are the type of people that you want involved in it, but you don't want any loose ends to it. So you're not going to necessarily tell them what their research is being used for. They're just going to see a continuous flow of money to continue to fund the research.
That's a good point. The other thing I was thinking about too, I'm like looking for these like imprints on MKUltra like activities and this, and that one guy that you're talking about right now, that professor who was shot and killed at his home, the person who shot and killed him had been escorted off of his property just days prior, and then was back again for carjacking. And then you look at where this guy lives, sort of out in the boonies. It took effort to get out to where this guy lives. So like the crime in essence doesn't make a lot of sense. But the reason why I say it has some of these odd hallmarks of mind control is because the guy kept coming out to this person's location, which sounds a lot like some of this, Delta programming, where these guys are told to do something and they do it, and perhaps there's some confusion in this mind control manipulation that's going on, that whatever they're there for isn't executed properly. And then I look at this murder that happened at Brown University. So these two professors, the one at MIT and then the one at Brown. I think we've covered this on another show, so I'll just keep it brief. But they'd known each other in Portugal. They were competitors for a position. One got it, the other did not, and they sort of had this estranged relationship from that point. But the guy who shot and killed the MIT professor, I wrote his name down, the MIT professor, he was a plasma physicist. Brown University dude is called Nuno Lulero, if I'm saying his name right. But he shot and killed two Brown University students and then drove to Massachusetts and killed this guy in his home. And then was supposedly had taken himself to a storage locker and recorded himself discussing going and killing this guy, which is, again, really, really strange behavior. It sounds so poorly planned out, so beneath somebody who has the intelligence level to be at Brown and then be competing for jobs at MIT, right? That you're like, how did you come to this very messy conclusion to carry out this crime? So again, like loosely, I could see some of these MKUltra ties where this manipulation is going on and the execution of that manipulation doesn't happen to plan. And so there's all these loose ends. It's really messy. There's other people involved, which if you go back and look at some of these MKUltra programs is sort of a hallmark of some of these mind manipulation programs.
Yeah, I can definitely see that with this guy who was from Portugal, who was living in Miami, drives up to Massachusetts, and for some reason goes to Brown, which, it's either they had a class there. There was a few stories that I heard. Either there was a class there or he thought the guy was teaching there. It kills two random people. It's almost like whatever was, told to him, if we are going down sort of a MKUltra type zombie assassin that was set up, that something the wires got crossed, that he went there and realized his target wasn't there, so just shot two people and then left, and then sort of recalibrated and found out where the guy's location was and went and shot him, and then drives to New Hampshire and kills himself. So to me, it's just there are too many unanswered questions as to motive. This whole thing about 20 years prior, up for the same not promotion, but scholarship or job or whatever, and holding that grudge for 20 years. Right. I mean, yes, it is possible, but that would be like a real severe mental imbalance, and I think that there would be signs there, some sort of stalking in this 20-year time period of incessant emails, of packages being delivered to the house. It just doesn't match that same sort of pattern of obsession that somebody who feels like they've been wronged. That seems more in line with what they would do before they would carry out a homicidal act. Whereas this, and when it comes to academia, ever since Ted Kaczynski and understanding what went on with him as far as, like branches of, what was it, Project Monarch or whatever sort of, what he was exposed to at MIT and then later at Berkeley, could it happen to this guy? Perhaps. You just never know. But to me, the perpetrator of that homicide seems more in line with a Ted Kaczynski style person than it does just some random guy who's really pissed off and wants to exact revenge on somebody who got a job over him.
I agree. Even if you held maybe like a grudge against that person, for 20 years, it just doesn't make sense to come out as that much rage that you go and murder them. Maybe they're somebody who you see an article they wrote on LinkedIn and you leave a shitty comment because you're like, fuck that guy. Like, that's the sort of crap I'd expect later down the road. Because like you said, if you're going to kill them, in the age of social media and having an online footprint, maybe you'd see a lot of reposting his stuff and then talking against it. Things that seem like, man, you're a little more angry about this than you should be. You're just some healthy indicators that this is unhealthy. I agree with you. It's the other thing about this too that of course is tied in is a lot of these scientists have to do with energy and then some plasma research, nuclear physicists, And then you go and look, well, what else is going on when it comes to sort of a community of scientists, a community of academics who've been approached by people who don't really fit in there. And they're all like, there's some questions about why this research was being, and these people who do this research were being talked to, this research was being looked at. It's the whole Epstein file connection as well, because of who Epstein was trying to talk to, some of these MIT professors or professors at, Boston University or wherever he was going to. And, a lot of this research, I guess, is in sort of ways is sort of loosely linked to one another. The point, I think the connection there is that it's sort of cutting edge research and looking for people who are high profile and cutting edge to use what they're doing as maybe leverage or to sell those things to other people. But then you have Amy Eskridge, who is the other scientist as well. She was the CEO of her own company. She owned her own company, but that was in Huntsville, Alabama. And then Huntsville, Alabama also is where NASA has a heavy presence as well. A lot of people don't know. A lot of aerospace related stuff in general is in Huntsville, Alabama. Excuse me. U.S. Air Force related stuff is there. And then obviously you have the nuclear lab guys in Kansas City. Those guys are the researchers, not necessarily scientists, but again, energy, research for space-related things. Like the guy who was killed at his home was researching asteroids traveling their travel paths to Earth, and how they can offset those travel paths and all this very obscure science or space science related, energy related things. And then so of course like the loose NASA connection here, or at least her location being NASA. It all has these hallmarks of not just being research at a university, but research that's tied to government bodies, right?
Right, and you brought up the MIT professor that was murdered. So he's working on mathematic calculations as far as asteroids go. So that leads me to believe, if we take the same path as the guy who was killed in California. He's doing this research into asteroids. The funding keeps coming in. He keeps spending the money to further his research to come up with these formulas. But could these formulas be repurposed into something else where it's not, projecting the path of an asteroid, but could it be used in projecting the path of some sort of, plasma machine? Or could it be used in projecting, some kind of a formula to open something up that would reveal that there is an ether? So to me, it's a lot of times it's not what it seems, but what the possibilities that it could be used as to be repurposed. I think your mic's off.
Appreciate that. The thing that came to my mind immediately when you think of just sort of how chaotic the travel path, I guess, of an asteroid could be and how fast it's moving is maybe if you're looking at how to track those things, maybe offset their course so they don't hit the planet. Hypersonic missiles, maybe, that's something that they're worried about. And I just want to make this very clear. This is all speculation and opinion, but that's a very fast-moving object that you're trying to track from a long ways away that requires a lot of math, a lot of math above my pay grade, that's for sure. Somebody like that, I could easily see how studying an asteroid could equate to studying how to stop a hypersonic missile, especially one that can maneuver while it's traveling. So I could see some overlap, I guess, in that area. I think it's why, too, so many of these professors get dragged into programs that they're like sort of adjacent to, but not necessarily doing anything in. And they have I think this has application in what we're doing, so I'm going to pull this guy in and going to talk to him, so to speak. I don't know, man. I don't think we're ever going to get an answer directly on any of this stuff. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that this is a sort of a case of just coincidence and I think it'll wind up being a big nothing burger anyway, because we're never going to get any answers, so it'll be a nothing burger in that way. But do you think it's a nothing burger in that sort of we're just seeing ghosts in the dark, as it were, and there's not actual real connection here?
My gut tells me that there is actually a real connection between them. Again, they don't know each other. They were working on different projects. I think that's totally possible, just like people at NASA, the CIA, like we had talked about. But I do think that they are connected just by the research that they are doing. I think it'll, when the history is ultimately written on it, and I mean, the recent history within the next 5-10 years,
Yeah.
I think that it will be, yeah, it was just coincidental. Nothing had really had to do with the other, and we've sort of moved on. 20 to 30 years from now, I think that more evidence will pop up, and there will be people like us who will start connecting the dots and say, oh man, remember, back in 2026, all these researchers and military people went missing, and here's what we found, here's what's come to light now. So they'll be in the same sort of position that we're in, but they'll have a little bit more nuggets of information to work off of than we have right now. And that just seems to be the way with any kind of pattern recognition that we see now or we've seen in the past. Is there going to be one smoking gun saying, oh, they were working on, a new hypersonic missile with a plasma tip on it that was capable of, zapping people into another dimension? We're not going to find anything like that. It's just going to be little dribs and drabs of things that are going to cause more speculation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that obfuscation is sort of the point when it comes to that. And the one thing I did want to mention real fast is General McCaslin is still missing. The incident of him going missing is really, really strange, just sort of some of the facts involved in that, and his wife's 911 phone call. But the other guy that went missing for a while, whose body was recovered, was the cancer research guy, Jason Thomas. And I've seen a lot of people online sort of linking how odd their disappearances were. Jason Thomas, obviously, his body was recovered. I just want to say, like, the reason why I feel like those, I keep seeing them being conflated about being like odd disappearances, even though one of their bodies was recovered, is because his mother had died, and then his dad died literally while they were making the funeral arrangements for his mom, and he was super depressed. And I think it's either his wife or his girlfriend, one of them, woke up in the middle of the night one day without him, and then found him outside at the mailbox, and then went back in the house thinking he was coming right back in, and then she went back to sleep and woke up and he wasn't there, and then was reported missing. He left, I think, his Apple Watch in the mailbox, and then they found his body. And then the indication was that he committed suicide. And so like that, if you, let's just say that his body was never recovered, like that's a very odd thing. You catch him at the mailbox, and the next thing you know, he's gone. He leaves his Apple Watch in the mailbox. So, all these really odd things. But he was recovered, and now the official report says he took his own life, right? So I think that loose connection, people are trying to say, well, these are two really odd disappearances. I think that is just coincidence. Somebody who's depressed, massively depressed, his mother dies, his dad dies right in front of him, and then wanders off into the night, and then unfortunately takes his own life. I think that's more than likely what happened with that. I just want to say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that a lot of times the people who are really into conspiracy theories, and I know I consider myself to be a conspiracy enthusiast, but I also know that life is also real. And as much as you want something to be connected, sometimes it just isn't. And in this case, it just isn't. You could go down the road, oh, it was a fake suicide, this and that. But the fact of his parents being deceased, we have no idea what his financial situation was. We have no idea what anything that he was going through in his own personal life. And to find out that he did take his own life, to me, adds up. It just kind of, it's just a weird coincidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And he was working on cancer research, and I guess had been a part of a project that made some serious headway in taking, I guess, cells out of the body and then re-engineering those cells to go back into the body and to fight cancer specifically. And that was pretty successful. So people were drawing the inference that they were finding the cure for cancer, and that's why he was taken out. But even that sort of research is an outlier on the other sort of research that was going on with some of these other scientists. You know what I'm saying? So It just, again, is like a timing coincidence in my opinion. So I agree with you, Tom. I actually think that this is probably going to just wind up being one of those things we never get any answers on, that there is probably some connection one way or another. And then to also be careful, like vet your information where you get it. I've seen a lot of this state, like especially Chinese state media, stuff getting shared as facts. And you know, I want to make the point that Russian state media, Chinese state media, Iranian state media, for all intents and purposes, every country puts out propaganda, right? And it's, you don't believe everything that the United States says. I don't, you don't, nobody does. It's the same with Russian and Chinese and Iranian state media. Nobody should take any of that information at face value unless you can personally vet and verify that information, and then, you know, however the process it takes you. So understand that even if you disagree with what's going on in the United States and you can recognize American propaganda for what it is, don't be so blinded by what you disagree with to just take the propaganda from other nations who want to see the U.S. do poorly. Don't take what they say at face value just because you don't like what's going on in the United States. You know what I'm saying? That deserves the same level of scrutiny and maybe even more than what's going on in the U.S. I think that's an important point to call out.
Right. It's just the confirmation bias that's used by Intel operators all over the world. You know, and we talked about it before, that the Intel community is so entrenched in social media from every agency all over the world, and they can see what has traction, what doesn't have traction. They can see trends developing, and they prey on those trends. So when somebody sees something, and Iran, I think, has been doing a masterful job at their propaganda with the animated videos that they've come up with.
The Lego guys.
Yeah, I think it's been really, really superior to what we've been doing on our end. But, you know, we can't really – well, I don't even know if the Iranians can see anything, you know, that would be American propaganda on their end, on social media-wise. But what the Iranians are doing they're preying on all the internal strife that's going on between, you know, the war hawks and the doves and the people who are sort of in the middle, who are disenfranchised with Trump and what his administration has done, thinking he's done a 180 on his whole stance on war. They're also playing on, you know, the whole APEC folks, you know, the supporters of Israel, and the people who are like, why are we even involved with Israel? And they're really exploiting that divide. And like you're saying, you just have to be you can't look at Iran and saying, you know what, they're making some good points here. All they're doing is reinforcing what you actually think so far. So just
correct.
You could look at it, but know what you're looking at. They're doing it to exploit you emotionally.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't want to make another point about Iran right now. Pretty much anybody in Iran who's got internet access is probably tied to IRGC or Quds Force. Nobody, for the most part, who is a regular citizen in Iran going through all of this has internet access. And this happens every time there's massive riots and protests in Iran. They kill the internet for the average citizen, which is why Elon Musk and all those Starlinks to line up over there for those guys to get internet access, even though that's not really working anymore. But just want to make that point. If you're seeing something coming out of Iran, like it's verified out of Iran, more than likely it is somebody who's a state actor, and by state that means IRGC. And I want to say this too. There's a bunch of accounts online that are calling, like, folks that are saying, like, coming out of Iran, right, whomever Trump is talking to, and, you know, they're giving him these assurances about Straight, or they're giving him these assurances about enriched uranium, and then immediately there's language that's the antithesis of that, and those people are being called Iranian officials, or Iran is saying, etc. I want to make the point that Iran has fallen into its design defense, which is a mosaic defense, where there's 31 different regions now that have different leadership, and it was designed this way. So there is going to, I think, always be counter messaging about this stuff, and then there's a bunch of rogue actors who still live and operate as IRGC and Quds Force guys that are always going to come out and say, this shit is, you know, the strait's not open, and they're going to send some gunboats out there to fire RPGs or drones at people, and, you know, or whatever is going to happen. And there's this belief that, I guess, you know, the U.S. is making things up. I don't think that Trump is making things up. I think he's speaking to people that he's hoping he can eventually put in place as leadership. I don't even think it's full regime change. I think it's like regime management, and that he is probably speaking to people who are IRGC, but are going to be more amenable to have American influence, at least for the time being, and he's hoping that that's what's going to happen. So I don't think he's making shit up necessarily. I think that he should watch what he says insofar as making such absolute statements. But again, I mean, you never know, right? Like he's making absolute statements to try to draw some of these people out so that they can blow them up, you know, when they're doing the shit that they're doing. But I mean, this whole situation with the straight is an interesting thing, but I think that that's more than likely what's going on. I don't think that they're just making shit up, quite frankly. That doesn't make as much sense to me.
No, and I think you're right. And I think it is all by design, because you can see the strange messaging that's coming out of D.C. We're at the point now where Trump has said the Straits of Hormuz are open, and if they're closed, it's because we're closing it to block Iran from closing it. It's like, wait, what? That is the weirdest tactical move that I've ever seen before. We're closing it so they can't close it.
Yeah.
So it goes back to the whole deception that you're talking about with Iran doing, saying, it's going to remain open, and then someone else coming out and saying, nope, it's going to be closed. It's like, okay, what's the right answer? It's just there are definite sort of red herrings being thrown in there. And so for Trump trying to comment on something that changes on an hourly basis, which it changes by design, is to make him look like he doesn't know what he's talking about and lose the confidence of the people of the United States, and especially with the mainstream media, because Iran knows better than anyone else that how much hatred they have for Trump. So no matter what he does, whatever he does to make himself look like a goof and not knowing what he's doing, they're going to run with that narrative. So they put all these poison pills in everywhere because they know that our media is going to do the bidding of their propaganda. So I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now when it comes to the narrative that's being driven about what's going on in the Straits right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other point I wanted to make about it is when you see somebody online, especially some of these bigger accounts, using language like, well, Iranian officials actually said Trump is full of crap. It's like, well, when you say Iranian officials, I want you to understand, like the average listener, it's not like officials the way you'd interpret it from somebody from like the State Department or the Department of War or the Department of Labor and Statistics or whatever. You know, these aren't people sitting in an office in Tehran anymore the way somebody's sitting in Washington, D.C. as an official. Like, calling them officials sounds way more serious, so that they have way more power, I guess, to make policy and drive policy than they do. So like call them what they are, IRGC rogues, in my opinion. Like, these are people that are part of a murderous regime of individuals who have inflicted damage on the Iranian people for the past 50, 60 years. Like, they're not Iranian officials anymore the way that this is somebody from the State Department with counter messaging to something coming out of the White House or whatever. Like, these are not the same, and you should call them what they are so people understand what you actually mean. You know what I mean?
Right. And just, I mean, real quick, I was just going to throw this in there because this sort of piggybacks on the whole propaganda push of the media. I started my career in television news, local TV news. And every news director I worked with, and this was back in, the early to mid 90s, every news director would jump on any reporter, any anchor person who used officials say, authorities say. They would always be, well, who said it then? And the only time that came into, where it came into the questioning that was going on, if it was a confidential source, then you would have to say a confidential source who was close to whatever. There was a long explanation of who this person was and the credibility that they had. We have gotten away from that, where we have reporters and anchors and producers citing unknown people. I can say, you know what? I've been on a text, chain with an official from Iran, and he tells me this. And there's no vetting of that person. I have no idea who they are. They just say who that is. Or, as I'm doing now, I'm just totally making it up. Yeah. Because it fits a narrative that I want to convey to people. And
Exactly.
we're seeing that more and more with journalists. That's why, you can't trust. I don't trust anybody that works for, a big conglomerate news organization.
Sure. Yeah, the threshold for sources and truth has become so low, in what you allow to count as a source. I'm glad that you said that, because it should be treated with the utmost scrutiny what you mean when you say an official. What do you mean? Do you mean an intern that works at the State Department? Right. Or do you mean somebody sitting in a decision-making position who's making this statement? And I think we've talked about this on this show as well. When these reporters from Wall Street Journal or New York Times or wherever, they say, well, a source close to the situation said this. Again, is this an intern who heard something through a door because they got kicked out of the room to go get coffee and pizza for everybody? Like, what do you actually mean? And when you see something like that, especially when the information tied to it is a hot button issue or something that has to do with something very important, and you see a source close to the situation, that should just be, not saying you should discount it entirely, but grain of salt here. Let this play out. Let's see what information comes out about this, and then I'll determine the actual competency of what's being said here. It's so simple. It really is. If you could just catch yourself in the act of these thought processes and then work your way through them and have a little patience. I was talking to somebody earlier today, actually, about this weird expectation people have now for to talk about the Iran war, for CENTCOM or SOCOM, because CENTCOM has some SOCOM elements tied to it, special operations elements, to come out and immediately give you information about military operations going on in Iran. It's like, or politics, policy changes. An executive order signed by President Trump is not a policy change in the way you think it is. It's going to be gone probably the second he's out of office, because that's what Trump did to all of the Biden era executive orders as well. You're so caught up in this need for instant gratification or instant information that's almost like you expect it and you're entitled to it, when really anything that's going to change people over time is going to be incremental change and actual policy and actual ideas that are being worked through by people who understand that this stuff takes time, and you have to be willing to commit yourself to the process and not actually want and expect instant change and instant information all the time. Like, I think that's simple exercise of slowing down and saying, I'm going to wait through this before I have an opinion, or I'm going to wait through this before I start making decisions based on this loose information, would probably save us all a lot of grief between one another, don't you think?
Absolutely. And this is how quickly people's memories go. It wasn't, was it 23 years ago when Geraldo was embedded with a Marine Corps platoon and drew out in the sand what they were about to do and got fired for it.
Yeah.
So to me, that you can't disseminate information like that in real time. It just doesn't make any sense, because what you're doing is you're putting everybody that you're working with, from Geraldo's perspective, in jeopardy. And that's one of the things about doing as many embeds that I've done in the past. I have always strove not to be the weakest link, because I would never in a million years would want the death of somebody else because of me and my lack of preparation for the environment that they have allowed me to record them doing their jobs in. And with Geraldo, I thought that was a totally justified firing. And
sure.
I also think that, you're right. In this day and age that we live in, where we need information as soon as possible, in some regards you can get it. But I think what we're running into with the government, at least, we've been lied to so many times that when they're not as quick and forthright with information coming out, there's a tendency to doubt whatever it is. It's like, oh, here we go. They're trying to get their story together. Certainly. But there's a difference between, to me, an ongoing investigation and a military maneuver. Sure. And, I think that, let's just take Charlie Kirk as an example. Okay. To me, some of the questions that I would have on the ground if I was a reporter would be to law enforcement: why wasn't the scene secured? Why did you allow the people from, turning point to take the cameras down? Why wasn't
Yeah.
the crime scene tape up immediately and everybody who had access there, taken somewhere and held until detectives could get their stories and statements from them?
Right.
So those to me are questions that need to be asked. Those are the types of questions that need to be asked by the journalists who are on the ground actually trying to get information. It's all timely information. If you're like with that shooting and you say, okay, do you have any suspects? Okay, if you do have a suspect, do you have some kind of description that we put out there? Anything to help aid the investigation. But we've come to a point now where it's like they want it all wrapped up as if you're watching a television detective show.
Yeah. It's a great point that you bring up with the Charlie Kirk thing, because there's two key elements here I think that contributed to a lot of what we see now. First and foremost, I think the FBI's incompetence and their messaging right away drove a lot of this. First and foremost, Kash Patel and his messaging on X about immediately catching somebody and having that person in custody, and then having to go back and walk that statement back and say that he was wrong. And then he showed up on scene as well. I don't know what he thought. Nobody would have, I guarantee none of those guys that are on the ground there at UVU and in Utah doing that investigation said to themselves or one another, I really wish Kash Patel was here to help run this investigation. Anybody who's ever worked in the military or police department or whatever, the second any sort of brass shows up, anything that you're doing already is going to stop, it's going to get sidelined, it's going to get gunked up, all of this. But then the other thing with this is too, just look at what instant information got you in that situation. It was wrong, right? It was immediately wrong, and it got shared out over and over and over and over again, thousands of times. There were a bunch of content creators and a bunch of regular people on the internet. You should want them to have a sense of restraint when it comes to the information that gets put out there, and making sure that what does get put out is accurate, current, correct, all these other adjectives, and that the instant rush to X by Kash Patel and some of these other people to put information out there, and to be first, and to, I don't know, I think did he think he was showing some sort of competence by getting on X and saying what they were doing? I kind of looks that way, probably. I don't really, to me, don't put a lot of faith in his mental faculties after seeing, what he does over the past, year and a half. But that's what instant information gets you, is wrong info. And the director of the FBI putting out wrong info after something as high profile as the Charlie Kirk assassination, that's exactly why you should want these guys to wait and sort of subdue yourself a little bit, and your entitlement over instant information is because of shit like that. And it just fed into this zeitgeist of, Egypt and Israel and lizard people and honeybees and all this other crap, that whatever the fuck Candace Owens has come up with to talk about it,
Yeah, but that kind of sort of amateur hour style of law enforcement that Kash and the FBI are engaged in helps promote the conspiracy theory.
Exactly.
And it to me, it goes back to, all right, well, is this incompetence, or is this feeding the narrative conspiracy theories that you want to get out there? So it's a really fine line, and especially when, in the Charlie Kirk thing, oh my gosh, there's so many weird things with that. Like the guy who said, I shot him, who we're finding out later, has been at a lot of different protests and claimed a lot of different
Isn't that weird?
things. Yeah, and then
that
all
feels
of a sudden
MKUltra-ish too.
Yeah, and then they find child porn on his phone, and he's locked away, and nobody has access to him. And then you have Kash Patel, like you're saying, coming out and saying, "Oh, an arrest is imminent." It's like, okay, well, you're saying this, but the people on the ground are saying they're still looking for a suspect.
Yeah.
So does that mean that this person that is ultimately arrested is a patsy? Did you say that because you didn't know what you're talking about, but you wanted to sound like, you were the man in charge and everything was going well?
Exactly.
Or did you have foreknowledge of who it was going to be?
It brings up all those questions. Dude, the CP thing is weird because it's obviously anytime it gets inserted into the conversation, it's an instant way to delegitimize somebody, and then anything negative inferred about them is instantly believed. It goes right back to the brother of damn it, his name just went out the back of my head. Yes, the brother of Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas shooter. They randomly find all of this porn on a Windows 95 operating server. Like yes. Operating system. What?
Like
that
terabytes.
Doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Like what? That doesn't add up. But immediately, he's somebody saying this seems so out of nature for my brother, and then he's just immediately delegitimized with this insane CP thing. You know what I'm saying? Like that. It's like the instant go-to, well, okay, automatically that guy is a piece of shit, And maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. And if it's true, then yeah, they're a piece of shit. But maybe it isn't true, And it seems to be that's really weird. That guy, the dude that they arrested, there was all those pictures of him at UVU, that older guy being arrested, saying, I shot him or I did it or whatever it was. Like, that gives off such MKUltra-ish vibes to me. Like, why stand up and yell that? Right. Why stand up and say anything like that unless you're looking for attention, And then, but the other thing that sounds like too is somebody trying to give somebody the opportunity to get away, because now you've drawn attention away from who actually did it. And that was the biggest question I had immediately after that. Well, was that guy a fall guy? They're eventually going to figure out he didn't do shit, and in the meantime, the other dude is getting away. Maybe. Speaking of people and doing things, you'd put a comment on our little group chat earlier about things to talk about, and you'd said the Oklahoma City Murrah building bombing. What came up with that made you want to talk about it? Because I haven't seen anything on it. Maybe I missed something. I'm interested.
Well, no, it was just the anniversary of it came up, and so a lot of people were rehashing it on social media. And I had just, actually, I'm in the midst of the book Blowback, which the woman who wrote it was a former producer at America's Most Wanted. It spent 30 years writing this book. So it's, it digs pretty deep into the entire case. And there are a few things that, to me at least, 30 some years later, that have never been answered. You have Terry Nichols and you've got Timothy McVeigh, both who were unemployed at the time, managed to build this giant bomb that almost brings down an entire building. So where did they get the money from? And there's never been any kind of trace of money of them, earning the money or having this amount of money to buy the supplies that they would need for a bomb that size. And then, within the book, you also have them tied into this Aryan Nation bank robbery gang in the Ohio area in the late 80s, early 90s. And then also, one of the other one that kind of jumped out at me is I don't think it's disputable that Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh actually built a bomb. And part of what this book goes into is they had put this thing together in their Ryder truck, but there was another Ryder truck, and there was a guy who was described only as Poindexter by Timothy McVeigh, who showed them a different bomb that was almost triple the size of the thing that they had built. So there's a lot of thought that was the actual bomb that was used. Okay. And now, getting back to Poindexter, there was a leg that was retrieved in Oklahoma City that didn't match any DNA from any of the other victims that were there, and the FBI took custody of it and destroyed the leg. So there was an unaccounted for body part that nobody knows whose leg it was. It was the leg of a male, so that it leads a lot of speculation to that was the Poindexter guy that McVeigh had alluded to.
I've never heard that before. I've seen the Ryder trucks also. I don't remember the name of the army post that's nearby there, but that there's photos of the same sorts of trucks that were parked on that military installation days leading up to that event, and then they were gone the day of as well. So I don't know how much does it talk about that in that book, those trucks and then their presence on the military base. What does it say?
Yeah, it just there was no explanation as to why they were there. But it did mention that that those vehicles were there. I remember working in TV news. I was working in Indianapolis when that happened. And I remember that day vividly because back in the news days when national news hit, you were just glued to the TV to see what was going on and if there was any local connection. And, being in Indianapolis, the only local connection was the federal building in downtown Indianapolis had extra security, so we had to go get video of that. And I distinctly remember seeing the two sketches of John Doe #1 and John Doe #2. And then the arrest of Timothy McVeigh, within hours or whenever. I can't remember if it was a day later or that day of the bombing that, I know he was arrested, like an hour or 2 hours after the bombing and then held. But I think he was officially charged like maybe a day or two later and then made, that dramatic on-camera appearance with everybody outside the local courthouse booing and yelling at him as he's going in there. And then after that, the whole John Doe #2 just disappeared. And I didn't think much of it at the time because I really, wasn't that much into conspiracy. I was only, 25 years old at the time. And so to me, it was just like, well, I guess that they were mistaken. And they thought, it was another passerby who somebody thought got out of the Ryder truck. And to me, there was always a way just to kind of, erase John Doe #2 from that whole situation. And then once Terry Nichols was introduced into it, it's like, okay, so he did have an accomplice. You could kind of see the picture, starting to build of, what they had. And that was just from, the government releasing the findings of their investigation, and at the time it was believable. I believed it. I also believed that with the people inside Waco lit themselves on fire, so that's what the government told me. So it was still that sort of a mindset, but years removed from that, it's like, all right, let's take another look at this because there are a lot of questions that have gone unanswered, and what was the reasoning behind all of this?
Yeah. No, that's interesting because didn't Timothy McVeigh give an interview as well where he implied that there was a lot to this story that was being stifled by the police, right? He gave an interview like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He gave an interview like that. In the investigation, they didn't talk about Timothy McVeigh and, well, they alluded to him. Well, it was a main, at the time, at that time, particular time in the U.S., and I remember this well because we would cover stories on gun shows, and that was the thing. Gun shows and militias were the big things, the big narratives that were being pushed out of D.C. by the Clinton administration. Gotcha. And that there was these militias that were in the country that were being built that one day were going to overthrow the United States, and that was the number one, terror threat that we were facing were these homegrown militias. And so with Timothy McVeigh, there is speculation that he, I'm not going to say that, he was an informant for the FBI or the ATF, but had some kind of loose sort of acquaintances. And there was one guy in particular that's mentioned in the book. Help me out for a second. Roger Moore. I'm thinking of it. There's a character by the name of Roger Moore who, I don't know if that's his real name. Nobody really does. But he seemed to put Timothy McVeigh on the whole gun show circuit back in the late 80s and early 90s, where Timothy McVeigh was in Florida going to a bunch of different gun shows where he'd be selling, his thing were the Turner Diaries. So he'd have, boxes and boxes of the Turner Diaries that he'd be selling at these gun shows, in an attempt, or I don't think really an attempt, but just kind of getting peripheral information about these organizations that, these militias that, were the new boogeyman for the United States. And then it tracks him up into, the Ohio area, and then, over toward the Midwest, and linking up with Terry Nichols, who Terry Nichols is also, an unusual guy. And, after his conviction, he's not allowed to talk about anything. He's off in a prison somewhere where he can't speak to anybody. So
right.
It's just one of those, again, it's one of those crimes that captivates the nation, and then all of a sudden the government presents it to you in a nice little bow, and it's all wrapped up and says, okay, here's what happened, and don't question it, or else you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, you talked about the FBI. They're always involved in some weird crap, man. Like the obviously what happened at Ruby Ridge, the sniper that shot Vicky Weaver, Randy Weaver's wife. He was also involved as the hostage rescue team sniper at Waco, Texas, which is where David Koresh, the Branch Davidians, that whole situation happened. And then also there was the insinuation that Timothy McVeigh was motivated essentially by what happened at Waco, Texas. And then like Bob Ricks was the FBI spokesperson, and he was the negotiator at the Waco, Texas thing. And that basically all of that was the motivator for Timothy McVeigh doing what he did at the Murrah building bombing, which to me sounds like a really dumb thing to do, in my opinion. Like, as far as we talked about motivations earlier with the whole professor thing, like that doesn't add up to me. But just the fact that there's the same sort of, with the same, literally the same people from the FBI involved in these 3 crazy incidents involving almost like what you're talking about here, Randy Weaver and the sovereign citizens thing and getting off grid. And then you have Waco, Texas. What does that involve? Wanting to be outside of the operation of, the United States and being your own community. Like, and this is speaking very loosely, obviously, like being your own community. And then have these motivators, like all these people are involved. They're all involved in these things. You'd think that level of incompetence or that involvement. I mean, I've seen this in the military where, well, we don't want that person anywhere near any of this shit because of X, Y, and Z. And so they've got a 1-day fishing pass for this, or they've got they're going to go do this other thing, So it's like almost self-inflicted wounds.
Right. And also another thing that is very hard for me to wrap my head around, Oklahoma City. And remind me, I want to go back to Waco for a second. But okay. With Oklahoma City, if you're mad at the government, you don't kill kids.
Exactly.
Especially if you're a former soldier, former Marine. I can't cross that Rubicon with it. I can understand, being in a militia, hating the government. I can understand all of that. But for you to exact revenge on the government by killing 72 kids or whatever it was, or 40 kids, I can't fathom that. I just don't see that in the makeup of somebody who, might be an alleged mass murderer. I just don't seeing them having that inside them. And I know, a lot of people will say, well, he's a demon, he lost his soul, this and that. Okay, I get that part of it, but I just don't see somebody who has sworn an oath to the Constitution, who has fought in a war, who could be able to make that switch to justify murdering children. I just don't see it.
Well, you talked about Ted Kaczynski earlier. Like, what did he go and do? He was mad at the government too. He was bombing federal buildings. Like, when you go to post offices and stuff like that, like those are all federal. They didn't involve kids.
Right.
Like there are so many other ways to go about exacting your revenge and taking it out on the U.S. government than doing something like that. That's a really, really good point. I agree with you.
But getting back to Waco, again, this was my time period in working in TV news. So going back to, what was that, 93, I'm working in South Bend, Indiana. And at the TV station I'm working at, there's also a radio station. And so Waco goes down. And I remember, thinking, oh, this is pretty cut and dry. This guy's running a cult. He has a bunch of guns. Now he's in a standoff with the police. What I didn't know is one of our DJs, his wife was a member of the Branch Davidians, and his daughter was in the compound at the time of the seizure or the standoff. his daughter ends up getting released. They had, in the very early stages of it, they had a release of children. I don't know if it was women and children or just children, but you see the video of these kids coming out. Anyways, his daughter was one of the ones released. So she goes back, she comes up to South Bend, Indiana from Waco, and she's reunited with her dad. And at that point, her dad starts going on Inside Edition, A Current Affair, all the tabloid magazines.
Remember those.
Totally fine with that. I don't have a problem with him telling his side of the story, but I also know that he's in a bitter custody fight with his ex-wife. And so, he's not going to, talk to her or David Koresh, because no matter how you cut it, there are certain cult-like issues going on with, living in a communal place like that, especially when you have one leader. So for a lot of us who remember Jim Jones, that's what it was like. It was like I was too young to remember exactly what was going on with Jim Jones and Guyana and everything else, but I remember it happening, and I remember my parents and other older family members talking about it. So to me, that was my frame of reference and going, okay, this is my Jim Jones. But getting back to my colleague and his daughter and doing all these interviews, that's when the whole narrative of David Koresh molesting kids started. And so it went from the ATF going in to, because David Koresh had a stockpile of guns that they wanted to get their hands on, it came into David Koresh is molesting all these kids. Whether he was or wasn't, I don't know. But after her release and her dad getting on TV, that became the narrative that was being pushed. And that started pushing the FBI to start acting. It's like, oh, we got to save the kids because, he's a child molester. Then it became that David Koresh was a child molester. It was holding all these kids against the will, and he was marrying them and having sex with everybody. And then that's when you saw the whole cult narrative start to form. And again, there are some similarities. Was it a cult? I would probably say that it was more of a traditional style cult when David Koresh took over compared to the old guy that he took it over from, just because of the way that he handled himself and the changing of his name and then thinking that he was some sort of deity. So, yes, I think at that point when he took over, he was a cult leader.
Totally.
Was all this going on? Again, I don't know. I'm just taking the word of it from somebody that I had worked with and what supposedly his daughter had said. And I know that she had done interviews too where they had filmed her in silhouette as not to give away her identity. Yeah. And, and that was the narrative that she came up with, or that she said. I shouldn't say came up with, because I don't know. She's most likely telling the truth, but still, you don't know, because at least for me, at the time I totally believed her, but knowing what I know now, just, having the wisdom that I've accrued just through age and being able to see different scenarios play out, how much of this is because of a custody dispute, and wanting to sully the reputation of this person that you were married to who now you absolutely hate. So
yeah, you've seen it happen,
I just thought that was very interesting, how just watching that narrative change in real time.
That's crazy. The way you describe your memory of the whole Jim Jones thing, Jonestown thing, is sort of the way I remember the David Koresh, Branch Davidian thing, because of my age, Like, I also have very vague memories of Kurt Cobain's quote-unquote suicide. I remember my parents talking about it, but at the time when that happened, it wasn't anything other than it registered the fact that my parents were glued to the television, you know what I mean? Right. And that it was something that was talked about. I don't even want to think, I swear I may even remember like the TV show Hard Copy talking about it. Do you remember Hard Copy?
Oh yeah,
that was another one. Yeah, back in the day, and my folks used to watch. But I like that you said when you were talking about what happened with when you were in Indiana, that everybody was glued to the TV, and that was like the only source or whatever for people to get info. That is gone. Something like that happening today, like what happened with Charlie Kirk, this, it's almost like it becomes an instant mess. Whereas like what you were talking about, how you believed this at the time, the news was saying this, and like everybody else, totally reasonable, totally rational to take the information for at its value, and then through the process of time and seeing things come out and people writing books or articles or stuff finally coming out that doesn't add up, you start to change your opinion. That is a normal process. Your brain wasn't absolutely inundated with 50 different opinions immediately, leaving you maybe either overwhelmed so you give up on it, and then anything you're internalizing about it is just off of a glance, or maybe there's somebody you sort of trust, you see, and they're talking about it, so their version of events aligns with you a little bit better or whatever. But I don't think we're ever returning to a place where information is sort of slowly digested and then opinions are sort of slowly formed. That's gone. I don't see any sort of return to that at all, and I see, and very well could see, utilization of that fact as the justification to sort of consolidate information and its export into one thing again, and then it being again used as sort of government control over you, because it's like, well, guys, there's 500,000 different places that we could get information from. We're going to scope this down and get rid of all this shit. We're going to change the internet. The internet is going to be way more controlled now, sort of like what happens in China with their Great Firewall and some of these other places. And then we're going to kill 200,000 accounts, and now you're only going to get it from these couple of places. Like I could see it being used as the justification to try and fix the problem, but obviously now you're getting into very Huxleyan, Orwellian territory,
Oh, absolutely. And to me, it all started with Monica Lewinsky. To me, that was the great divide in the United States.
Pun intended?
Between the citizenry. Because that spawned MoveOn.org, and
Sure.
then that comes on the heels of the 2000 election between Bush and Gore and the hanging Chads, and the Supreme Court finally ruling that Bush is going to be the president, and then a year later we end up getting 9/11. And at that point, it seemed like everybody was coming together. It was like, holy shit, we didn't see this coming. We were all focused on militias because of Oklahoma City. We thought that was our biggest threat. But
The
these
threat
dudes
is now
in
external.
caves, yeah, it's external. It's like, holy smokes, we got to rally around. We got to go get whoever did this. And so there's this whole groundswell of support. But then you get Iraq, and then weapons of mass destruction, and then the divide starts opening up again, which everybody thought had healed with 9/11, but it was the same wound from 2000 that it opened up, and is the same stab wound that came with Monica Lewinsky. Got bigger during 2000, closed up during 9/11, and then reopened during the Iraq invasion with weapons of mass destruction. And then when those weren't found, the wound got even bigger and bigger, and people became more and more mistrustful of the government. But this time, it was on the left. The left was like, the government is screwing you over. They were buying into every conspiracy theory that there was. And in retrospect, they were right on a lot of them when it came to like Halliburton and Dick Cheney and getting their mitts into rebuilding Iraq and everything else that they were making money off of. They were 100% correct on that. But then you start getting into the Obama years, and the divide became even more because Obama comes in now. I'm the great healer. It's going to be a new path for the United States. And then he starts taking that divide and making it toxic at this point. And once it,
identity politics.
Yes. So now the country has gangrene. At first, we just had a knife wound that, would pop open because the stitches weren't holding. And then it was trying to be held together by some Band-Aids. And then it just started gushing. And now he just came in with the scalpel and opened it up even more. So now we have a gaping wound that we can't do anything with. And then you get COVID. And for a lot of us, that was even more of a sorting. It's either you're with the government,
certainly.
you're and
Trust science or don't.
Yeah, in science and all that. And then that becomes, for a lot of people, going, okay, if they're lying to us about this, what else have they lied to us about? So now the pendulum switches from the left going down the conspiracy rabbit hole to the people in the center and more right going, okay, everything that we've learned in the past is all BS now. And which is a really bad place to start from, but you got to start from somewhere. And so I think if you start, that is, being your launching pad, then you can start making reasonable decisions and coming to reasonable conclusions, where some people just get lost in that. And then, you know them, I know them. They haven't recovered from, going down the rabbit hole and staying down the rabbit hole and not coming up for a little bit of air. But getting back to, the original premise of your statement is all that trust in the media is gone. It's never going to come back again. And there's no trust in government from a lot of people except the hardcore, sort of lefties and righties who believe that the government is this pure sort of benevolent entity that we just need to rely on and let it make all the decisions for us.
Yeah.
So,
no doubt, man. No, I totally agree with you. I even know some people, and it might have something to do with working out here in California, but that have never gone down that rabbit hole and still just firmly sit in this spot of everything is fine. It's weird. Like those are the ostriches with their head in the sand, as it were. Sometimes I wish I could have that level of willful ignorance, because they seem pretty happy. I don't know, man. It seems like a gift and a curse to be able to do something like that, because you're genuinely clueless. But I actually was going to ask you, when you were doing your embeds and you were making some of the film that you were making, did any of it put you in the pathway of the service members out there looking for these WMDs at all?
But like in Iraq, or
like any of the.
I don't know if I've shared this story with you, but I've shared it to other people in the past. So when 9/11 happened, I was working on the Cop Show, and we were in Fort Worth, Texas, and it was a really strange time. Everybody knew that the world had changed, and right around Christmas, I heard on Fox News. Fox News was on. I just got out of the shower. They were talking about camera crews going to embed with troops in Afghanistan. Okay. And they said that it was Jerry Bruckheimer's production company along with Bertram Van Munster. And I was like, holy shit, Bertram Van Munster, he's the guy who hired me on Cops. So I reached out to his production company. They wanted me to go over to be the first person over there, because they wanted to have me set the template for, how this is to be filmed, because they had pitched it. It was going to be a lot like, the Cops TV show, the way that, just fly on the wall, no reporters or on-air talent. It's just going to be the guys hunting bin Laden and their story as they hunt for bin Laden. So, of course, it got greenlit because of the relationship Jerry Bruckheimer had with Donald Rumsfeld and everybody else from when he produced Top Gun, the original one. Jerry Bruckheimer, famously had enough stroke with the Defense Department to get an aircraft carrier to turn around in that famous story, which aircraft carriers, as we all know, don't turn around. But Jerry Bruckheimer was able to pull it off.
That's crazy. Yeah. There you go.
So I get everything that I need to go over to Afghanistan from production. My kit's all ready to go. And a day or two before I was supposed to catch my flight, I get a call saying, hey, you're being detoured. And you're being detoured to Bahrain, where you're going to go to the naval base that's there. And we're going to have you with the Navy, and you're going to be with the boarding team of the USS Way City, and you're going to be boarding ships going in and out of Iraq. And I was like, this is really weird. The fight's in Afghanistan, and I'm going to Iraq for some reason. And they're like, well, you're the first person to go out there, and the Defense Department wants to see, how the show's going to look. And we just figured that they wanted some footage of the Navy. And I was like, this just doesn't sound right. And I was okay. So, a day later, I'm on a plane. I land, in Bahrain. I link up with the public affairs officer at Bahrain, get on a helicopter. I fly out first to the USS Lake Champlain. I'm on there with their boarding team for a couple of days, and I get with their boarding team. We start boarding ships going, in and out of Qasar, which, I guess that little inlet or river or whatever, it takes you right into Iraq.
Okay.
And they're like, oh, the reason why we're doing this is the reason they gave me. Well, the reason why we're doing this is from the Iraqi, Operation Desert Storm. And these are the UN security conditions that were put because Iraq can't have oil or figs. That was really weird. We're embargoed on coming out. So you're looking for oil and figs. And we have a suspicion that they're also importing military vehicles. And it was like, okay. And so, I go with these boarding teams. They, search these ships for oil, for figs. If they, were found with figs or oil, they were put kind of in a timeout zone so everything could be offloaded. Sure. And then the crews would have to return to port. Or actually, they would port in Kuwait, and it was crazy. Some of the sailors on these ships I felt sorry for because the ones with Iraqi passports would be beheaded as soon as they got on the dock in Kuwait. Shit. So you'd be getting back onto the rib to go back to the ship, and they'd be crying and screaming and holding on to your legs because they knew what was going to happen to them.
Yeah.
So, we did that for a few days, end up in the Way City, continued on with the boardings, and had gotten, some footage of some GMC pickup trucks that were going into Iraq. Obviously, they were made in another country to, get away from being imported directly from the U.S. into Iraq. And it was like, I guess these could be like military vehicles. They seem to be just pickup trucks. Never really saw any kind of like armored vehicles. But one day, one of the boarding team members was opening up a container because they'd have to cut off the locks of the containers and open them up to see if, what was in there. It started smoking. And it was like, holy smokes, what's going on in here? And, the guy in charge of the boarding team is like, get down from there. We're not sure what that is. Don't be exposed to it. He comes down. And I can't remember. It may have been dry ice or something like that. But that's what was used in the edit to show the Department of Defense what was going on, and it was played up of, the boarding teams are really scared right now. It could be some kind of chemical or biological agent. And so I was like, God, you guys are, playing this up a lot. Because still, my mindset is, the wars with Afghanistan, the 6'5" 6'5" Saudis still alive. That's who we want to get. So they're just building, the stakes to what we're doing, which is very common in reality television. You always want to build the stakes of impending doom and terror and everything else when you're doing an in-bed show like this.
Sure.
So it's like, okay, I get that. But then, years later, I realized what they were actually trying to do was build the case for the invasion of Iraq. To me, that was the whole idea of saying, oh, look what's being imported to Iraq. We have no idea where it's coming from. Are these biologics? Are these chemical weapons that could be used against us at a later date? It was that's when I started realizing, okay, I was sent here on purpose to push a narrative, not to be embedded with Green Berets to hunt Osama bin Laden, because by the time I got there, this was April, he was already gone, April of 2002. If and I think the accounts are correct that after Tora Bora, he was gone. When those helicopters landed, when we had this weird ceasefire and these helicopters were allowed to land and leave. But yeah. So that was kind of that was the only time where it was like, I was embedded looking for WMDs, but it predated the Iraq invasion by a year.
Yeah. That's crazy. Very interesting timing, as most things are. You know what I mean? That's a pretty wild story, man. Especially that has to make you feel some type of way of like being inadvertently used for things that were not what they were made to seem to you. You know what I mean? That would be kind of frustrating to me as well.
Yeah, at the time, I was pissed off. I had thought that,
Sure.
that these 17 guys had taken down the World Trade Center and killed people at the Pentagon and killed people in Shanksville. And it was like, and I had a full-time job on cops, and I had quit that job just so I could do this. I was, totally, hey, this is the best way that, I can serve my country is by showing the guys in the armed forces going after the perpetrators of 9/11. So I totally went into it thinking that, I was doing something to help the cause. Whereas, now that we discuss it, it's like, yeah, in retrospect, I
got yoinked into some
I was
shit.
partially used for another agenda.
So many people, many such cases. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to that's such a crazy story, dude. I always almost want to ask you, like, every time we talk, dude, like, Tom, what's another crazy story you have? And it's funny, I don't know if you've seen our live show, but I talk about no party affiliation because, like, at the top I'm like advertise like what we do, and I always say that you're the most interesting man in Hollywood that you've never heard of, is what I say. And it's true. You've got all these like stories, and that's why I asked, because I know some people, like older GWAT vets who are actually in Iraq, like looking for weapons of mass destruction, who will tell you, like, look, man, we found gas. That's a WMD. It's just not the WMD that they were talking about and alluding to, which obviously was a nuclear weapon, which of course is exactly what the implication is with Iran, And so that's always sort of the implication is not wanting to have a Muslim extremist regime having a nuclear weapon, which is totally, rational thing to not want them to have. But again, which is why it leads to stuff like this. But no, you do, dude. I always want to ask you, like, Tom, like, what's just another crazy story, Tom? I want to hear it. I was thinking earlier about, talking when we were sort of loosely talking about like Ruby Ridge and Waco and the Murrah building. It's like, I bet Tom like has had some or seen some really weird things before where the media has been used as a smoke screen for something. And I bet he's got like a crazy story related to that sort of thing or whatever. I'm sure you do. You got 100,000 stories, man. They're good.
The one thing I'll say about, the show that I did, it was called Profiles from the Front Line. It's still on YouTube. We did the show, and then it got hung up with it was for ABC, and Peter Jennings was pissed off because we had access that the media didn't have access to, and we got really compelling stories that we were telling. So when Iraq kicked off, that's when you saw the embed. And the embed with the news media was a direct result of that show that we did with ABC, because the government realized that they had a great propaganda tool that they could use. Is instead of keeping the media at bay, they could bring them along. And when you bring somebody along, when you go on missions, mentally the people that are there, have more skin in the game and are going to report differently on what's going on. Where, I knew going into it that, I didn't have any kind of agenda other than, documenting these guys capturing and killing bad guys. That was it. That's all I cared about. I didn't give a shit about anything else. But when you have the media that, it is always looking to make somebody look bad, when you get them in that situation where these guys, not before they did their embed, they were trained, they went to different, I don't think the security contracting business was like really up and running other than like Blackwater, where you had villages and stuff where contractors would go before they would cycle out. But they would go to different bases and, go through different exercises with, actual troops before they went into Afghanistan to reinforce to them what they're doing was actually real. So the first part of Afghanistan, when you had that embed of journalists and producers and photographers, the reporting was a lot different. It was more pro-military because they had an extra skin in the game for what they were doing. And then eventually the media realized that they were getting played. And so they pulled back a little bit from doing those embeds.
That's interesting, sort of laying the groundwork again for, the media to stop trusting the institution, and then in turn reporting on what they're finding, and then leading to more distrust of the institution. Totally justified distrust of the institution, but just saying, kind of how that cascade effect, waterfall sort of works. That's kind of wild. Speaking of like stuff like that, like cascading into things that it isn't. One of the other things that we sort of mentioned we may talk about is the Charlie Kirk ballistics. To just kind of go back to the Charlie Kirk thing, there were those articles that came out that said, oh, the bullet didn't match the gun. But if you read the article, you saw that actually the results were just inconclusive. And the reason why it didn't match the gun is because the fragment they were talking about was so messed up, there's just no way that they could use it to identify anything. Well, that's not the same thing as those headlines. And then now there's more ballistics that have come out to show that, yeah, actually the gun found that was in Tyler Robinson's possession and has his DNA all over it and all this other stuff was the gun, in fact, used to perpetrate this crime. And I have yet to see some of these podcasters, some of the big ones, come out and say, yeah, we were wrong. Here's why, I was wrong. And especially like some of the veteran guys who should know a little bit more about ballistics, being disingenuous, talking about this stuff. My frustration with it, and we could talk about this however you want, whatever thoughts you have, you don't have to stick with my thoughts on this, but it's just frustrating seeing people not correct the record themselves. Rather, they just would rather contribute to the grift, as it were. And that's frustrating.
Right. And the ones that I've seen that have addressed it are saying that the ballistics, the fragments of the round that hit Charlie Kirk didn't come from his body. So I'm not sure if whatever fragments that they have that they're saying are connected to that gun, were they retrieved from the body, were they retrieved from the scene, where were they retrieved from? So I think I can't speak for these podcasters who came out and said it didn't match or whatever. But that's the one that I see, at least a couple of them clinging to, is the fact that those fragments didn't come from Charlie Kirk's body. So, I'm still, it's just that whole scenario with Tyler Robinson being the shooter and the evidence that we've seen so far. I question a lot of it. Is he the shooter? Maybe, I would like to think that he was, again, so we could get, a nice package with a bow on it and not having to have this doubt continuously linger with, the distrust of the government and law enforcement. Well, when I say law enforcement, I don't mean local law enforcement.
Yeah, you mean the FBI.
The federal law enforcement, which I don't have any faith in whatsoever, and I'm very mistrustful of. And
likewise.
Yeah. Yeah, I could tell you stories about my divorce and ATF agent who is friends with my wife and what she did, but I won't get into that because you know what? We're still friends and everything is good, but I just thought it was a shitty thing for a federal law enforcement person to do. But anyways, I digress.
Sure. Well, there's plenty of reasons to not trust the ATF without bringing your ex-wife into it, so I think we're in safe territory. I was going to say, I think it's interesting because the list of evidence that's come out that's like being admissible in court against Tyler Robinson, some of that actually involves never before seen footage, security footage from UVU. And I haven't seen the footage, so that needs to be set up front. But supposedly this footage shows him casing the place leading up to what happened, and him being present on campus beforehand, and then him being on campus during and then afterwards. Some of this security footage, which didn't hit the news, obviously, right after. And, again, this kind of goes back to the expectation of information. Well, a lot of this stuff gets held close to the chest because evidence can ruin and derail investigations and then criminal proceedings because you can poison the well with a jury. And it also makes me think of any other time that evidence has been made public and it's ruined an investigation. The obvious one that I always talk about is when Dianne Feinstein was the mayor of San Francisco and they were hunting Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, and she was given some information that the police had been holding close to the vest and not giving to the press, and that essentially was the sort of shoe that Richard Ramirez was wearing, and that they had used that shoe print to identify murders that they knew were linked to him. And it just so happened that that shoe came in two different colors, a white and a black version of that shoe, and they had different distinct foot patterns on the bottom of the soles of those shoes. and that they knew that he was wearing a pair. I want to say he was wearing the white pair of those shoes, which sold even far less of the way far less of the black version of those shoes, and because of that they were to identify which stores those came from, and then to get basically how they were identifying him. And she made that news public at a press conference she did, because he had a few murders that were up in the San Francisco area, and the majority of them obviously were down in SoCal. But just that's what happens, something like that. And the moral of that story is he never ever wore those shoes ever again to commit a crime, Richard Ramirez. And it was because she put that info out there, and she totally ruined this massive lead and this way that they were completely identifying and linking him to these crimes. So again, this expectation of information and the protection of evidence, it's a very real thing that deserves to be guarded and treated with respect, right? So, but I'm interested to see some of that footage when it comes out, because obviously there's going to be people that are like, is that real footage? Is it AI? All this other stuff that's going to happen. So,
right, and I think that's when you run into why did they hold on to it for so long when you get into that argument, which I can see. And I can also see what you're saying, and I totally agree with what you said about Richard Ramirez's shoe, because that was an ongoing investigation, and that was going to be a huge clue that the law enforcement was holding on to find this guy. And like you said, when he found out about it, he changed shoes. Yeah. So, but if there is this footage that's out there that they say there is, it all leads back to, well, why isn't it out now? Because you got the guy in custody. He's no longer out on the streets. So to me, that's, that plays into the whole, the conspiracy crowd of saying, oh, it took this long to get AI up to speed to, cobble something together that we're supposed to believe. Right. But then also look at the track record that we have, with the release of the Epstein video and how that was doctored. So, I just don't think that there is going to be a period of time now moving forward when federal law enforcement comes out with any kind of video evidence that people are going to say, oh, okay, yeah, there's the smoking gun. I totally believe it, because I think that Epstein video just kind of poisoned the well for everything. And I feel really bad for the guys who are actually, good guys in the field for the FBI or the ATF who are actually doing good work, just getting screwed by the higher-ups who, as you know better than anyone, the higher-ups always, screw everything when there's any type of investigation or any kind of decision-making that goes on.
Yeah, man, this is like true of almost any organization. There's tons of FBI agents, I'm sure, that are out there right now that are dealing with human trafficking, child sex crimes, drug problems, all that stuff. And these guys, they just get delegitimized by the shitty leadership on top of them as some of the mismanagement of the more high-profile cases. And they say they're in the FBI, and maybe they've spent their entire career protecting kids or stopping human trafficking, very legitimate things, very decent people doing very dangerous work, and automatically they're tied to these big profile cases, and people don't take them seriously or think they're part of it or whatever. Yeah, absolutely, that happens. Military members can get wrapped up in stuff like that too, because most of us are just doing, not to use this, doing what we're told to do, right? We're just pawns, I guess, in many ways, shape, or form, and all volunteer force of pawns in some ways, respectively. Not to say that entirely, so don't take that for anything other than what it is. But no, I think a good way to sort of wrap this episode up is to say this is never going back to any sort of normalcy again. It's not everybody crowded around the one TV at in the building to watch something crazy going on the news, and you've got 20 people standing around that TV. And yeah, maybe some people are interpreting the information differently than the others by respect of your brain and personality, but you're all looking at the same thing. And I think that even that now today has it's not even a unifier on information, because of the threat of something like artificial intelligence or doctoring things, even without artificial intelligence. Somebody went into Photoshop and did something to this photo and doctored it, or doctored this video or whatever, made it look like one thing when it isn't. And the information economy itself is so poisoned. I don't think there's ever going to be a return to it. And just like anything else, it'll be used as a weapon against you, and it already is, and it'll get used as a weapon to take more liberty away from you, unfortunately, which I think is one of the things you could do to protect yourself against that is to not give in to stupid bullshit ass information that comes from a source close to the incident, and take things with a grain of salt, and sort of have some expectation management when it comes to accurate information, and not give these people that are so blatantly obvious that they are grifters the time of day, and walk away from it, because the second they lose their audience, the second their influence is gone. And if you care about the truth, and if you care about the reality of the situation, then you walk away from people that are just, they're not making sense of things and understand like how people build narratives. Well, okay, like that could be loosely related, but it's not really tied into it. That person's grandpa was in the CIA, so now you're trying to make this assertion that they're somehow tied into the CIA when there's no actual evidence of it. Like that gets said all the time. It's like, well, there it is. There's the CIA connection. It's like, really? Is that like my grandfather was a Mason? I'm not a Mason. I've never been to a lodge. I've never taught. You know what I mean? Like I'm not any of those things. My grandfather used to launch weather balloons in the Air Force when he, back in the 60s and 70s. I don't have any knowledge about launching weather balloons. Like that makes no sense. So just vet your information, and have some self-respect as well, to be somebody who's willing to call out misinformation, so blatantly obvious misinformation. My advice to everybody, I guess, take it with a grain of salt.
Right. And for me, it's like, if I hear something and it sounds too good to be true, it's like, okay, is this justifying my own my own bias in whatever it is? Is it confirming that, my confirmation bias? Or is it something just doesn't seem right? I can't tell you how many times in recent history, I would go back to COVID. Every time that something was said about COVID, whether it was a social distancing or my favorite of all time, you can't go in a pool because of fecal sheddings. Fecal sheddings is one of the greatest terms of all time. Right. And I'll never forget Ezekiel Emanuel talking about fecal sheddings. And it's like, okay, first of all, I like the term fecal sheddings, but do I really think that a virus can be transmitted through a chlorinated pool? There's absolutely no way.
Yeah, I agree.
And to think otherwise, because if that's true, then you would be getting pink eye all over the place by every pool that you went into.
Right.
So that part of it, it just didn't ring true to me as in a lot of other things that are going on with COVID. And for me now, with this age of information overload, it all has to do with my gut reaction to it. If it sounds too good to be true because it's it's puffing up what I already feel about something, that it's probably wrong and I don't want to bite into it. If it's going against what I know, through my eyes and my ears in the past history of my life, then I also know that it's wrong. And it could be, on a topic that I feel, totally different about than what's being pushed, but that side of the topic might have information that has just been discovered that could lead me to change my mind on whatever it is. So yeah, you're right, you're absolutely right. You just can't buy into anything right now.
Not at all. Nope. Multiple sources, and even that sometimes doesn't help. Well, guys, thank you so much for listening to another episode. Hopefully next time we'll have Chris and Drew on here. It was fun talking to you, Tom. Little two-way episode. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, man,
for sure.
It was great. I had a blast as always. I needed some alone Brandon time.
I like it. Too bad we're not in the same room. You know what I mean? Not to infer anything, since we're talking about inferences. But yeah, that would be good. Hopefully one day soon we can get on our doing our little side project that we talk about with COINTELPRO. That'd be pretty cool. I would like to do a deep dive on that with you. You have such a great base of knowledge on how information is manufactured, and information manufacturing is so tied to COINTELPRO. And so your insight on that will be absolutely priceless. I can't wait to do something like that with you, man. It'll be cool when we get the chance to. But you guys, please check out the show notes. Please check out Tom and Drew over on Balls and Banter. You can find Chris and I on Friday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific time for our show Live Fire. Podcast episodes dropping on Saturday, and then obviously these No Party Affiliation episodes tend to drop on Wednesdays, sometimes on Thursdays when I'm a retard and forget to send the information out there and edit the episode. That's on me. But yeah, we'll catch you guys in the next episode, and don't forget, don't believe everything you hear on the internet.
This concludes our scheduled programming.